All right, there we go. It is now noon here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I am. So hello, everyone, and welcome to the first edition of PON Live of 2025. My name is Nicole Bryant, and I am the Managing Director here at the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School. And we are so excited to gather today for this first presentation of 2025, and it's the occasion for me to wish everybody a very nice start to the new year. We have gathered today for an exciting presentation from Max Bevilacqua on teaching negotiation in the prison system. We are so delighted to welcome all of our participants and audience members back to PON for this next session. Now, we do have one housekeeping note that I want to do before I introduce Max, and that is that, as you will notice, we are disabling participant chat for this session, which is a deviation from past practices. And this is because we feel that it's in the best interest of ensuring that all of our attendees remain focused on the speaker and the topic at hand. We received a lot of feedback around chat at the end of last year and concluded that it was the best interest of inviting our honored guests to limit any extraneous chatter in the middle of their presentation, which is exactly what we would do if we were all in an auditorium and people started having side conversations while someone was up on stage. Nevertheless, even though participant chat is now off, we of course want to ensure that our audience has a chance to engage with the speaker. We will still have a lively discussion featuring a Q&A at the conclusion of this presentation. So please start thinking of questions as the presentation goes along, and use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to put them in. We will also, of course, share contact information both for our speaker and for PON in case you have any feedback or follow-up conversations. And then finally, because of course we still want to know who's joining us and from where each time, I've asked the stellar PON events team to set up a few polls to let us know who is in the virtual Zoom room, so to speak. So if I may ask our great team to start by putting up the first poll, and if our participants would kindly respond, what region are you connecting from? We'll give you just a few seconds to let us know where in the world you are at this time. Okay. And why don't we go ahead and end that and show our results. So 73% from North America, but also a good contingency from Europe, some Asia, Africa, South and Central America. We also put other up there in case anyone felt that those regions didn't best communicate their location, or if you were zooming in from space. All right, great, thank you. Next poll, please. Are you a frequent attender of a PON live event? Is this your first? Have you been here before? Do you come to every single one? We would love to know your past attendance with PON. Great, thank you so much. We will go ahead and close that out. Okay, so we've got a variety, but a couple of folks who never miss one. So thank you to them, and then those who are frequent participants. But we are very happy to have you, whether it's your first or 50th PON live event. Okay, and final question before we get started. We'd love to know more about what brings you to negotiation. Are you involved in negotiation in your professional life? Are you a practitioner, a faculty member? Do you just adore this topic and want to know more? Or are you just really here for this presentation specifically? All right, great. We've got good participation here. So we'll go ahead and share the results so that everyone can see who else is there. Lovely. So a very good mix of people who are very dedicated to this, but also some folks who are just tuning in for this topic or first time. Great. Thanks everybody for playing along. I know that this is a little bit different. We Look forward to hearing your feedback around it. And again, we hope that this will allow everybody to stay concentrated on the speaker and topic at hand, which brings me to our wonderful speaker and topic. So Max Bevilacqua is a longtime associate of the program on negotiation. He is the founder and managing director of Mindful Negotiating, and he teaches all around the world. He's taught at Harvard Law School negotiation workshop, at the program on negotiation, at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, at Boston University's Questrom School of Business, as well as a consultant through his own practice. We are so delighted to have him here today to speak about his work teaching negotiation in the prison system and the lessons that he has been able to impart there, and what we can take away from it as practitioners and folks who are interested in this topic. So without further ado, I'll invite Max to turn his camera on, and I will pass him the virtual Zoom microphone. Max, thanks so much for being with us today.
Nicole, thank you so much for having me. Having sat through many a PON Live and admiring your facilitation as well as running it too, it's surreal to be here. And Laura San Pietro and Diane Long and recent acquaintance Lindsay Sullivan, thank you for making this happen and for supporting me. Yeah, if you enjoy this session, if you're interested in it, please let us know. And if you don't, please keep it to yourselves. I'm just kidding. And the absence of feedback does not at all make me nervous. So my name is Max Bevilacqua. I've been a PON acolyte for a while. And long story short, I had the opportunity to teach negotiation in a Massachusetts correctional institution. And there are many things that the PON world and our toolbox can bring to the prison system, at least in the US, in New England, speaking regionally. And there are do differentlies that we have. So first, what we're going to do here, just to go over purposes today, we're going to set the scene of what it looked like in this particular instance. I just want to caveat that I can't overgeneralize across systems, and that we're talking about one correctional facility that is actually now closed down in Massachusetts. But I'm going to give you a little more detail to set the scene. I'm going to share the worked wells, the few things that I think that landed, and also more painfully and poignantly, my do differentlies for next time. And then I just want to riff briefly on the idea as prisons as frontline negotiation academies, and a place that sorely needs tools. Okay, so setting the scene. I had been in a prison before as an undergrad in Georgetown, doing GED tutoring for the Arlington Detention Facility. I engaged in a program called Jericho Circle, which is an offshoot of the Inside Project. And I think you might have a link at some point to a documentary called The Work that basically started in Folsom Prison. And it was men on the inside in a maximum security prison, basically doing group therapy and really building their own conflict container. So when I refer to container, I'm also kind of poking to the 5 Ps, thinking about place, process, product, et cetera, that everything we do, what we wear to a negotiation, as well as where it is, when it is, and what the lead up to the table is, affects the product. So that's the reason I'm giving you this download here. So again, this was a medium security men's prison. It was known to be closing. This was an extra source of stress and irritation because the men inside knew that they would be going elsewhere, but they didn't know where they would be going, if that was going to be closer or farther away from their families, closer or farther away from potential enemies. So already on edge. And just to name it, because I had to name it very early in prison, I'm a white guy from Marblehead, Massachusetts, which is an affluent town. And I had to name that right off the bat because we were about to enter a very stagnated kind of caste type environment. More of that later. The class was called Negotiation and Conflict Management. We had 3-hour classes twice a week for a summer semester, and it was very hot. And I think this also lends itself to irritation. It was through the Tufts University Prison Initiative at Tisch College. The wonderful Professor Hillary Binda runs that initiative, as well as a few others that put Tufts students really inside and learning alongside inside men. In terms of the difficulties, of which there were a few, a big one was the inability to really understand who my participants were and what they were dealing with. So I was pretty blind in that respect. And maybe those of you who have negotiated with government or any large institutions might be aware that it is not easy to get a hold of someone or make things happen in terms of getting technical equipment for the room, or really the process of what I would have needed to do to coordinate guest speakers and the clearances that they would have needed made it fairly prohibitive. So I think from the get-go, not to make excuses for my performance, I felt that wanted to do differently from the start was have a little bit more control over the container, more relationship building with the wider administration, because just getting in was a process. The classroom itself was locked with correctional officers outside. I had about 16 students. And in terms of how class started, it required that myself and another professor go in at the same time, meaning that if either one of us was early or late, didn't matter, we had to go in together. Also, depending on the correctional officer that was screening us, doing security, variable thoroughness is what I'm going to say, in terms of going through our things and searching us, such that we didn't really know when class would start. And at least for me, the first thing we can do, the first communication we can send, has something to do with being timely. And so that's something I had to name early too. And that was, at least for me, a source of frustration in terms of what I was communicating to class in terms of expectations if I myself wasn't on time. What I'll also say is there's a little bit of, if we want to think about like in-group, out-group, or contact theory, it was interesting because I work with the military, I thought I would walk into the prison and not have any antagonism with correctional officers. But my kind of very being there to teach seemed to cast me into a group of sympathizer or something that for some, and not all correctional officers, made me kind of an out group. But then to some extent, then help my relationship building with inside men. There's a basic container there. And again, really looking forward to Q&A. In the classroom, so the first dilemma is that I believe that every negotiation course should begin with a prisoner's dilemma. And I didn't know whether or not I should call it the prisoner's dilemma, because I was sensitive again to the disparity that's evident the moment I walk into the room. And very important that it was important to me that I not try and be anything that I wasn't. And yeah, I think that's probably a good strategy because people will figure it out. But the first issue was I wanted to play a version of the prisoner's dilemma. So we played card game. It's a variation of the prisoner's dilemma. The first thing I noticed is that there was very, very low trust. That might not surprise you, but I think there was a full absence of any cooperative moves, at least to open. And so that alerted me to something which is probably obvious to many of you in terms of the heightened shame of being in prison and degradation. But the ability to give trust was not as present, probably not a winning strategy, potentially. The card game, as well as other simulations and exercises, carried over not only after the simulation, but in between courses. In some ways, you're teaching them where they live. And so they're playing rounds and rounds. And I say playing not to trivialize, but if you think about interactions in terms of game theory, rounds and rounds of cooperation or defection are being played up until the exercise and after it. And something that I learned was just to really have definitive closing time, to debrief, to separate the space between the end of an exercise and going into anything else, because the emotions and energy would often carry over. The value of reputation is hugely important for negotiators, especially in prison, has literal worth and value. Just a continuation of this, the fear that I had in terms of do no harm was not seeing the context of what was happening before class and after class. And so again, there's this open question of when you're going to tap into these difficult things, when you're dealing with a population that might have complex post-traumatic stress disorder, what do you do? Some of you might be familiar with an arm exercise, which is an exercise that's a version of the prisoner's dilemma where people lock hands, and the goal of the game by the instructor is said to get as many points for yourself as possible. And the hack to the game is that it's not zero sum, so you can take turns kind of getting a point. But there was a question of, do I really want to set men on the inside up for this ego battle where they might engage in arm wrestling, and can I contain that, given that I was the only person in the room? So that was a consideration. And again, even naming the prisoner's dilemma, I had this heightened anxiety, which all I could do was name, which was to say, because I think when I talked about the prisoner's dilemma, because I concluded that it would be disrespectful and condescending not to tell people what it was actually called. And one of the students said, I bet you've just been waiting to tell people that you've teaching the prisoner's dilemma to prisoners. And that was like day one. And that was some of the testing and early trust of why are you here? Which is a big part of the relationship. Huge range. from, I would argue, genius to developmental disability, which made catering to those who are eager for more content not super easy to get everyone on the same page. Something that we might like to talk about in terms of pedagogy for negotiation practitioners is having a meta moment where maybe a conflict actually arises naturally, or you have the opportunity to, in real time, do the thing that you have been talking about abstractly. We had a conflict in class, and so we had just done a mediation section. And so I was like, let's mediate this. Some people got it and were here for it. Many people were like, this is so tedious, this is so boring. And I was like, you're not wrong. So large range, I would argue that that's not too different from my experience in higher education. I mean this based on the belief that behavior is a matter of degree and not kind, which is to say that it's, first of all, there is criminality outside of a prison and there's genius inside of it. But when we think about just the intensity of the experience, in some ways you can look at this as a really abhorrent labor management issue institutionally, which is to say that in some ways, what I kind of knew I was teaching against was correctional officers, was the implicit threat of force or isolation in terms of negotiating, and that wasn't something that I was as familiar with. So I don't know if this is a helpful lens to look at it from, but for me, kind of treating things as a matter of degree, which is to say that men in prison and the correctional officers are part of an organization, that there are analogies between that organization and other institutions like schools or even corporations. I only have limited ability with correctional officers, and I think the basic conclusion is not that different for most of humanity, which is there are good people everywhere, and there are people who abuse power everywhere, and that to some extent people suss that out. But what was tough is that because the correctional officer has an interest in timing and when you count to make sure the population is the same, no escapes or medical issues, etc., they're going to end class early. So those interstitial conversations that I think are the most rich, someone coming up before class or someone coming up after class, were often shortened. And because they were scarce, they were actually a source of tension or conflict for who got at time with professor. Self-segregation by race. There was essentially a Hispanic, a Black, and a white breakdown in my class. And I had to be, well, I tried to be mindful of spending similar amounts of time, eye contact, etc., in the same, because there was this question of whether or not I should be mixing up chairs. A good facilitator might say, yeah, let's move the energy, let's break up patterns. And one of the responses from one of the students was, because we don't have a lot of space in here, we're very sensitive about it. So like, I don't think you should do that. And I heeded that. And then another student was like, that's BS. You should. So anyway, hypersensitivity to space, not only locked inside with supervision outside, limited tech, et cetera, we tried to make it as much of a classroom as possible. But space was something I thought about a lot. There's also this big question, I think, in teaching negotiation, which is how strict are we about laptops and phones, et cetera? Even though there wasn't as much connectivity in this correctional facility, many had tablets of some sort. I eased off on that and was glad I did, because afterwards I learned that many of the students were basically regulating by having something else that they were looking at. So again, I was kind of coming in trying to show enough assertion of our pedagogy and what we do, and enough flexibility just to be like, this isn't my home. So self-segregation was a big piece and something you might want to think about in any class, but especially prison, is how do you want to deal with that? And one of my do differentlies might have been to, on day one, create different norms around seating. Okay, I'm going to go into tooting my own horn for the few things that worked well, and we'll talk much more about the do differentlies, of which there are many. The most pivotal thing that I did was on day one, I walked in and I looked every single student in the eye and shook their hand. Having negotiated with myself to be in a place of, I don't know how I can help, but I'm coming in from a place of service. That's my primary intent. So that's like kind of the double loop learning. That's my mindset, so that the actions of humility are genuine. So getting into that space and meeting each person, not above or below, but at, was something that I think is intuitive, to most people, but just can't be overlooked. And when we think about 7 elements, relationship is huge. Professor Brian Mandel at the Kennedy School talks about the first 180, first 180 seconds in terms of structuring the negotiation. To my mind, we're in these nested dolls of negotiations all the time. And the first one was, I was asking for attention, and they were asking for something useful, and we were negotiating that throughout the semester. And so I framed it, as I kind of mentioned before. I was like, look, I'm not gonna, I'm from Marblehead, Massachusetts. I grew up with a ton of privilege. I'm going to teach you as if you're my students, because you are. I'm going to enroll you as my students. And then I said is like, given that I'm less familiar with context, you need to tell me inevitably when I say something dumb. It's going to happen. You just tell me when. And so I like to sometimes say to myself, no smart people, only smart processes. It was a matter of time before I introduced something. They're like, that was tone deaf, that didn't land. So, name it to tame it. Something I'll just add early on in terms of what went well process-wise also is we did a mindful minute to open class. I'm skipping ahead a little bit there. That was important. A lot of what we were doing was thinking about negotiating with ourselves and how that relates to our negotiations with others. And a lot of that had to do with somatic awareness, labeling feelings, being aware of them. So, no time like the opening to just be with oneself and to draw attention to the self. And I'm curious about other people's experience. They very readily, the students very readily adapted this practice. Whereas, and I've also seen this in the military, like open to this mindfulness stuff, whereas in the corporate space, more difficult to do. So to me, there's an interesting conversation because I think gender is hyper relevant here, but in this hyper masculine environment, it was actually easier and kind of par for the course to be like, let's get in touch with ourselves, which is not something I'd expected. But anyway, I frame this as look, I'm here, you got me. I'm going to teach as best I can, and you're going to need to help me co-create. So I really launched this or pitched it as a pilot, which I suppose everything is to some extent, but that made me feel better in terms of how I was coming into the space. I had them journal. This was intense, and I felt it was important to ask them to reflect, and for me to get a little bit of a sense of what their stories were, and their relationships to conflict. I'll show you what the assignments were towards the end. When I think about respect and the Latin of it, spect to look, spectare, and re again, to look again, I took their handwritten journals and I typed them up for a few reasons. And one was literally to see again. So they would know that I had faithfully transcribed. And then I also commented, like in word bubbles on the side, like some ancient Holy Scriptures do with commentary on the sides. I put it on the sides to kind of try and model. Maybe we'll drop a link maybe about Robert Keegan and subject to object development, but for people to be able to have some distance from themselves in the past and to be able to be in conversation with themselves. I'll talk more about that after. But journaling to me is this huge window into development that is very powerful. Content-wise, getting to yes with yourself was the place to start. It really resonated with these men to think about negotiation as negotiating with self first. Now, sometimes in a corporate or even a legal environment, I see some responses that I'm like, don't worry, don't worry. But again, just like the mindfulness sitting with ourselves in the opening minute, they were with it. They have, many have plenty of time to be thinking about these things. And so for someone to do it with them and to have a framework, I think they were surprised for the most part that negotiation entailed things like this. When we did word association on the first day of what comes to mind with negotiation, sleaziness came up the most. And I thought it was wonderful. And something that we should look at, that labeling one a professional negotiator would make at least this group less likely to trust you. That's of interest to me. So getting to yes with yourself, which I'll put kind of the larger flow chart of the book on the next slide. But double loop learning, just the idea that we can't just change our results. We can't just change our behaviors. We need to think about the activity of our interactions, of our negotiations, and how we manage conflict in order for new options of behavior to appear so that we can then have sustainably different results. Again, I think this is implicit, but the BATNA of violence pervades. And when you have a container that uses the implicit force of their guards or isolation, that's real, by the way, in terms of just like housekeeping of attendance, someone no longer showed up and it turned out that they were in solitary. So this is another thing that we contend with, which is the inability to have predictable partners or pairings, which would have been nice for some predictability, but became very difficult in terms of who is even showing up. 7 elements and ladder of inference were core tools. I didn't put them up because to me they're like bread and water. Familiarize yourself with them, and they'll sustain you for a lifetime. We talked a lot about relationship and communication, positions versus interests, option generation, and alternatives. If I were to do it again, I might have reduced the amount of tools I gave them, but we'll get to that. And ladder of inference, I'll talk about just a very little bit, but again, these are staple PON tools coming from Urey, Fisher, Patton, and ladder of inference, Argyris, and Schoen. We talked about French and Raven's bases of power. Again, we'll go through that. Nonviolent communication, Richard Schwartz's internal family systems, attachment styles, and thinking fast and slow, system 1 versus system 2 thinking. Maybe you're already getting the idea that this is some overflow or this is an overload. I think it was, but these were the things that people resonated with. I won't purport to explain William Urey's work for him. I'm sure he had many resources that you should check out getting TS with yourself. But basically the idea is that we're fundamentally negotiating with ourselves before we're negotiating with someone else, that our goal is to put ourselves in our shoes before we do it in someone else's. And I think that is fundamental and corrective. We can talk more broadly about what correction means in terms of negotiation, or what correction means in terms of justice, criminality, et cetera, in the state. But a lot of this is providing a corrective experience, which is to say, I don't expect you to empathize with someone else who's upsetting you, whose worldview you might disagree with, until I hear you, because you may not, like, sorry, take a step back, and sorry, Diane, another link here. The On-Scene Guide for Crisis Negotiators by Frederick Lansley says that we don't talk people out of a barricaded position, we listen them out. And one of the reasons that is effective is because for many people, that might be the first time they've ever been truly listened to. I think this is true for people on the inside and on the outside. So really just saying, put yourself in your shoes, align yourself with where you are, and kind of like an acceptance piece was huge. And that inner BATNA piece of, that no matter what, I'm on my side kind of thing is really helpful. The whole framework is useful, but suffice it to say that whereas for me, I would have thought getting to yes, the OG would be the place to start. I had a lot of luck not doing that, starting with getting to yes with yourself, and generally speaking, centering the person and rewarding self-absorption, or making the self and the self's behavior the data to evaluate is, to me, the best way to draw people in to become curious about themselves. I won't go through Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication. I'm sure many of you know it. It's pretty aligned with the ladder of inference, in that you're basically separating observation, what a camera would pick up in a room without judgment, separating observation and evaluation, or selected data and interpretation. In the nonviolent communication process, which we practiced, we also went specifically to like what the needs are. So this works well with talking about interests. What are the range of interests we could possibly have? What are the possible interests beneath certain positions? Feelings, this is something that I think we can all work on. I'm still working on. I gave them long sheets, like basically expanded vocabulary for emotions. And we really pushed each other when we were doing our mindful kind of check-ins to name the feeling and to normalize that. And also something that I think we can do more of, sometimes we say like, I felt abandoned, but nonviolent communication would say like, and the ladder of inference would say that actually layers in a judgment about the other person's action. And so nonviolent communication is all about owning the actual sensation of, I felt hurt, I felt lonely, without ascribing judgment to the other person. For instance, like I'm feeling unsafe or triggered is a great way, I think, to throw a wrench into a conversation that we kind of unstuck ourselves from using NVC. So again, I wanted to give them as many tools as possible to see what stuck. They liked this stuff specifically around, parsing out feelings. And I would say, I mean, there wasn't much differentiation aside from the level of stress and shame present in the room in terms of like, it was a normal spread like any classroom. And some things resonated with some people and others it did not. I'm going to just to stay on schedule, I might be going a little bit faster here. They also really liked bases of power. And again, just in the same proportion that other students do. We talked about these bases of power. This is French and Raven. I think this is from 1959. There were 5. They added the 6th, informational power. Many of the men inside were familiar with reward power, with coercive power, with legitimate power. And so one of the assignments I gave them that you'll see was, what have you been using? What source of power have you been relying on? What source of power would you like to rely on? And what could that look like? And a lot of the men talked about expert power, referent power, and informational power. So again, in some ways, we're also thinking about parsing out like I want power or control, and kind of digging deeper there. And I also just want to name that there's a lot that can come up in all of these things. And so those are also under my do differently, which we're approaching. Really quickly, also internal family systems, the idea that there's this core, undisturbed, beautiful self that through trauma fractures into exiles, managers, and firefighters really, 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 really resonated with them. The idea is that we're courageous, confident, calm when we're in our core self, but when we're under extreme stress or trauma, that we think about these different roles. And for me, it expanded the idea of internal voices that were helpful to just name, that we have parts of ourselves, and maybe this is kind of like Jungian psychology of the shadow self and integrating it, thinking about integrative negotiation, but exiles are the pieces of ourself that we're normally holding away, that the protective and reactive parts of ourselves are worrying will destabilize the system. That's our shame. And something that I should have mentioned, that I will mention later, but shame to me is the most powerful interest. To avoid shame or to garner pride, which is the opposite of shame, which would be love to some extent. The links between excessive shame and violence, or shame as the necessary but not sufficient condition for committing violence, is huge and central. And being hyper aware of shame, I think served me well in that environment, and I think in many. But we push away shame. There's a shame of even naming the shame. So the idea is that there's this protector, the manager, that is always looking, maybe some hypervigilance there, people pleasing, fawning, any type of these behaviors in order to have some safety, and often tries to protect us, but maybe overworks and ends up harming us. And really where this internal family systems landed as an important tool for us was firefighters, that with big, big emotions and complex stuff, the idea of numbing, addiction, obsession of any kind, this resonated in terms of like, great, I can now name that in terms of subject-object development. I can identify that not as just me. I see that that's my firefighter. And so that implies that I have a manager and exiles. And again, I think this expanded sense of self is good. And I also want to name that I wish I had clinical supervision, because we're getting into tough stuff. And that's a line we should be thinking about. Very quickly, the Thomas Kilmann assessment, which you might have seen, it's a favorite of many a training and trainer. I just wanted to point to the fact that I think this is kind of a corporate version of attachment theory, which is to say that where we were heading, and the internal family system brought up, was we were entering their family system, or the idea that the voices that they were internalizing were actually from their family. And to me, this idea of cooperation or assertiveness, or care for self, care for others, is also kind of the matrix for attachment styles of insecure, secure, disorganized, etc. Not perfectly, but I think that understanding of the blueprint of our relationships that is imprinted really early onto child by primary caregiver, and how that shows up later, is really impactful, while also saying that this is, this changes and can change. One other thing that was helpful in terms of moving from a reactive to a thoughtful, mindful form of negotiation was Kahneman and Tversky's concept of thinking fast and slow. System 1 is that automatic thinking system, what is triggered right now, and seeing this person who's upset, like what that does to you, that's system 1. Whereas if I were to ask you what 17 times 24 is, just start to think about what that calculation is, you're engaging system 2 thinking. I don't know if it's a perfect analogy, but it was a nice way for me to talk about reactivity versus thoughtfulness, in terms of like, hey, we're playing a game and we need to be in system 2 here. And that's why we use some of these tools to slow it down and think through at that level. Our finals. So there were 2 components of the final. The first was a role play or a skit of the men to demonstrate, to teach a concept, right? Teach to learn. They were fantastic. Every day, prisoner correctional facility events, trades, negotiations that they really applied the tools to, that I wish I had known about to then in the beginning introduce the tools via those kinds of contexts. So in some ways that was selfish in terms of really seeing like where this shows up. I would have liked to done more advanced diagnostic for that. But the skits were also great ways for them to own concepts. And one student used the opportunity for another student to play their parole board and to actually try and provoke them. So it was like a hot buttons where a person enrolled another inside man to kind of say, well, what about this? What about this? Simulating kind of like difficult tactics at a parole hearing. And that was incredibly vulnerable to do in front of everyone and truly beautiful. Parole hearings are something that need to become part of the canon because a lot of the misfit in terms of classic PON stuff and stuff that you might need here is just the difference in the organizations and implicit batness and all of that. Now, there's also a piece of the final where I felt I needed to give them something, and that thing was going to be a book with their journals typed up and with my comments in the side. And I blacked out anything that anyone else wrote, but you can see the first prompt from the year was, what is your relationship to or with conflict? And the goal here again was kind of respect, literally to look at it again, to spend time with their writing, decipher, put up there and engage with, and also for them to hopefully try and model a little bit of rapport, a little bit of nudging of doing ladder work. Our second one right now was second prompt was, what do you really want? What are the most challenging negotiations you face right now? And again, this was me learning on the fly, trying to understand what would be effective for the class. And again, engaging with it, prompting, trying as much as possible to be non-judgmental, and really just interacting with someone's thoughts. Definitely some of these thoughts were intense, and we'll talk about it and do differently later. As mentioned, I asked them about sources or bases of power. What do you draw from the most? What are the ones that you want to draw from in the future? And what could that look like? And in giving them back this packet with my commentary on the outside, I also had them fill out a ladder and write a letter to themselves. The goal was for them, and I left spaces in the margins beyond my comments, for them literally to interact and continue the conversation, to have meta comments, to comment on my commentary, which was asking direct questions, to use the tools to apply things and to make them think as best as I could. And the goal there was just to do something that showed care beyond lip service, was to give them something that had the tool, 7 elements and ladder of inference in it, and their answers to these assignments with as much of my thoughts as I could. Do differently, I'll race through because I know we're getting close to time. More abbreviated temperature checks. When I opened the door for people to share how they were doing today, I would get some pretty intense answers. Or if I asked what something playful or what I thought was playful, like what would be a superpower you might like to have, some of the responses were intense. And some of that I think was kind of testing. But what I will say is that I began many an opening exercise that I wish that I might have put more definition on because it could spread. Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway is I had really no experience of the large, prominent thematic negotiations that they had, negotiating with self, something we shared, but negotiating with other inmates, especially if you wanted someone to be moved off your block and what that actually looked like, as well as the ethics of talking about the distance between what should be versus what is something I would want to put a lot more thought into. Correctional officers need this tremendously. I think we all need these types of awareness and training and mindfulness. It's also a stressful environment for correctional officers. Their rates of domestic violence, mental health issues are high. And I would argue it's because of the work environment that they are in. So I think really enrolling correctional officers would be helpful. There's also this tension there that a correctional officer might look in and say, look at these students who are getting their bachelor's degree from Tufts I don't know if I can even pay for college for my kids. So again, there's this class caste kind of clash of like low socioeconomic males and a culture of violence that, at least in this particular prison, was tough and was something that we'd want to address before going in. Negotiating with attorneys and through attorneys, I think would be really useful. More than anything, the parole hearing simulation would be fantastic. A co-facilitator to kind of build the space and the container and to model in front of the team or in front of the class would have been helpful. More of a system for office hours. Somehow, again, that's another structural restraint in terms of needing to negotiate with administration to have this, because it created some conflict about who got attention and time. And just wider relationship building, like we would tell anyone. It would have been a lot different if I had, I don't want to stereotype, but I should have brought in Duncan, right? Like that could have been a move that I made, or that might have fell badly. But I really had no relationship with people on the inside, and I wish that I had. And so I think changes in these institutions and things will require long-term relationship building. Self-care protocols, some of those journals were intense, and separating, moving between the underworld of prison, even for a privileged voluntary visitor, was intense. Really quickly, they loved in this particular prison, they had access to Vikings on Netflix. I wish that I knew what they were using so I could demonstrate tools through what they were actually watching week to week. The Family Crucible, I walked in one day and they were glaring at me and I was like, it's not all about me. But then someone was like, why the F did you assign us this, like dumb book? And I was like, oh, say more. He's like, I can't relate. Like, I don't know my father. This is about like, a New England white family, middle class, upper middle class white family. I can't relate. And I was just like, yeah, you're right. Like, sounds like that was a miss. And that was also a great opportunity to try and model taking feedback, which one always had to be ready for. So I would throw out the Family Crucible, which didn't land. Getting to Yes also, even though we took core concepts as a book, didn't land as well. And yeah, I would love to generate case studies. And I've learned through this, you can see right here, there's a Transformative Negotiation, a book by Sarah Fetterman. I believe she's at the University of San Diego, who's doing work like this. And so, we're in an era of proliferation to bring the good word of PON to the corners, the far corners of the universe, and case studies. And that method would be particularly helpful to kind of depersonalize what people are going through. But if they can't have a facilitator who's had their life experience, to be looking at other people who are actually in context rather than the kind of white collar things that we might be bringing in. Just to say that the correctional facility is a really powerful place and a giant opportunity to eliminate waste or to make use of potential, and where more could we need tools, creative tools for managing conflict more than people will be reintegrating to society, which then brings up our entire purpose. But again, negotiations are happening intensely in prisons. I would argue that they are unintentionally advanced academies of intense negotiation, and really serve as a suboptimal and inefficient organization that needs attention and could benefit from these tools. So I'm going to end it there. Thank you for listening and for your attention and for being here. And I'm going to hand it over to Nicole.
Well, we're going to do a little duet here, Max, but first let me just say what an incredible presentation this was. And I hope that all of our audience appreciates that in the chat, you've been getting an absolute masterclass level syllabus for people who want to explore these topics further, whether it's negotiation or behavioral theory. There's a lot to unpack here, so thank you. And I will answer some of the questions that we got on that housekeeping. First of all, yes, this session will be recorded. You'll have it up on our website in a couple of days. So if you want to review the slides or any of the information that Max has presented here, and we will also amend the citations that we've been putting in the chat to the event webpage so that you don't have to watch everything again to get that, so that you can review and figure out what your next January, February reading list is. So Max, absolutely phenomenal. And I'm really impressed with all that you were able to bring. I mean, this is a fully developed and very advanced syllabus that you presented here. And it sounds like it landed really well, absent a couple of things. And I think it's interesting to dig into them, and wonderful um, that you acknowledge also that there are things that you would do differently. So I'm looking at our Q&A, and thanks to everybody who's already put questions in there. Please continue to do this. Let's start with a question that you and I were talking about when we first logged on. We have folks wondering what's next for this. You mentioned that this
Yeah.
facility is closing, and I kind of already know the answer, but I think the general public would be interested to hear what's happening.
Thank you for your kind words. I don't know. And where I'd like it to go is more work within Massachusetts correctional institutions. As hopefully, I'm from Massachusetts, so I'm biased. I always had the impression that Massachusetts is quite advanced, and it is in many ways. In terms of the carceral system, not so much. And so there's kind of like, this is what's in our backyard, and coming out of Fletcher, we were also just talking about like conflict opportunities. So in terms of practicing or a distressed environment, prisons are ripe in terms of need. And again, for people who are interested in getting involved with conflict, I just think as a privileged outside person, as I might be identified, I got so much. It's so selfish in so many ways to go into the prison for perspective. And I think also being aware of that and naming that's important. This is a long way of saying I want to work in the prisons and I want to build relationships with the proper channels in a long and lasting way. ROCA is an amazing organization run by Molly Baldwin that works with high-risk youth to do like CBT. I would argue negotiation stuff, reframing, double loop learning with high-risk teens. So to me, there's this piece that is thinking about the health of family systems, the state institution, and where those intersect with the part of the prison that's youth services, which sometimes can be a pipeline from failing schools as well. So also shout out to the late great Jesweld Salacuse for institution building. That's where I got my inspiration to look at negotiation within institution building, prisons, schools, courts as institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, Wonderful. So given that, and we certainly hope that this is going to take shape in a bigger form, and I'm curious, we'll talk after about some ideas for how to make that happen. But was there ever any discussion about bringing in correctional officers to this training, or doing a separate training with them? We've got a number of questions from people in the chat asking,
Yeah.
if there was an idea for this to be a general training for different groups.
Yes. Um, there was. In fact, I would have posed that this would be the primary audience for the training, given the power imbalance. Ideally, I mean, this is a larger discussion on contact theory. I'm thinking like Alport, and I'm also thinking about the structural inequality outside of the room, such that bringing them in the same room would be a longer process. So it's absolutely something that I want to do. And it requires, I think, resources and clinical supervision to some extent, buy-in from leaders within the administration. Even when you go into a training in a corporation, if their leader isn't there, that says something, whereas people will pay attention if they are there. So again, I think we needed help in the larger stakeholder map politically from the institution. And again, there's this unfortunate, polarization of this unnecessary polarization, of either you were like cop or you were inmate sympathizer or something like that was the feeling that I got. And that was a miscalculation because I thought my military experience would translate and that I just kind of felt at home, and it didn't. And there are also status implications there of correctional officers and cops as paramilitary, again, at least in right now in this decade in this location. So yes, they need to be brought in. It's kind of like it's a fool's errand to, I would say, just teach inmates without helping them within the system that is so stacked.
Yeah.
So we have to.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, You also mentioned, Max, some of the in the do differently part, some of the other materials that you wish that you'd had, case studies, et cetera. What would be sort of your priority as you went around looking at that? Would you wish to work with inmates to develop case studies? Do you think you have a good sense on what might work now? I mean, you mentioned parole boards as being, something that probably should be generalized to the absolute difficult conversation that needs to happen and
Yeah,
irrational actors and places like that. Um, where would you kind of start if you were thinking about new curricular materials?
it's a great question. It has to come from the people that are in there day in, day out. And part of the function of the journal was also for me to get some of that information. Um, yeah, I think it would need to be developed with also men who have transitioned and women now in certain programs as well who are transitioning into outside the prison, right? Like I think there's like conceiving of the life cycle of the negotiation, which is not just survival in prison, medical attention, whatever it may be, but reentry into society. Of course, like you're saying, it prompts a larger conversation of what even is the point? Like, is this a correctional institution? Is this punitive? Like when we think about penitentiaries, penitents, in some ways, to my mind, these are extreme monasteries, right? Like, why aren't we in there giving them these tools to negotiate with self and others, which, by the way, again, many outside people also need. So I guess the thing that anchors me, Nicole, I don't know if this is responsive, is that behavior is a matter of degree and not kind, and thinking about the prison as an organization like any other, inefficient, deeply inefficient, fails at its mandate. But also what you're bringing up that's super important is the conversation about what is the mandate and how does the US feel? How does what I would argue a Christian nation feel about retributive justice? What is justice? But the big takeaway for me is that the family is kind of the key to this not just internal family systems, but like Murray Bowen theory, work done by Jody Shire that's been incorporated through Triad, and the law school of just really incredible stuff that really comes back to the family crucible, even though that's not the book you should use.
Which is okay, and it's okay to recognize. So, are there any measures, Max, that you got of participant satisfaction, that you can speak to, quantitative or qualitative?
The the mode of feedback I got was much more qualitative. Um, the reason that I shared that the best thing I think that I did was greet them with respect, genuinely, was because that's what they brought up. They're like, look, we know within 10 minutes whether you're here to teach at us or to teach with us, or something like that. That kind of like Mary Parker Follett power with or power over. And they were kind of sniffing that out from the beginning. And again, and I've seen this too, like, especially if you're someone who did not go through the system like I did, it has to be named immediately. Like race has to be named immediately. I don't know, is that responsive to your question, Nicole?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, do you think that the prisoners would absolutely recommend this again
Yeah.
themselves, right?
I
Those who,
think I think the answer is yes. And I think they were like, it's a miracle I took this because it was called negotiation, because what we did not line up with negotiation. And to me and to us, maybe we have, I don't know, I think there are roughly camps of people like G. Richard Shell, who I think would say, like, look, a negotiation requires an agreement. And then there are those of us that are more expansive, that like, hey, music is a negotiation. And so I think at like negotiation, not leisure, really the work. And again, highly recommend the documentary The Work, that it's including a lot of shadow work, integration of self. And roughly speaking, I think at least Western society is kind of exiling their shadow self into the prison system, but that's not how it works, right? Like we can't separate evil. To me, that's like a very arcane um, neuroticism about how evil works. And I think understanding shame as a pathogen and the way that we correct is a really important conversation that we're pretty behind on. So
Mhm.
yes, I think they'd recommend it, and they would make fun of me for saying "say more," which I was delighted to be mocked for. There's definitely some things I wore that they would not have recommended, but overall, I think they felt like it was a place, it was a classroom. I tried to make it feel like a classroom, and I think that's particularly welcome in a correctional institution.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, Max, we also have in the Q&A, and we'll get you a copy of all of this, of course, lots of people who are just chiming in to say that they really appreciate your presentation
Oh,
and
you.
you did a wonderful job. We have a former director of the BU Prison Education Program
Wow.
who is here to commend you.
Oh,
Someone who has done mediation training for prisoners in the UK and would be keen to develop international partnership if you continue this work.
yes, please.
And others who say that if you do expand, they would love to help you teach. So I think there are a number of people who are supportive of this initiative, and you should feel very proud to end on such a high note with that. So really, kudos to you, and thank you so much for all of this. And we can't wait to see what happens, and stay tuned for the next edition. So thank you for being here today with us to present. And thank you to, we had 160 participants at the high note for our first PON Live of January. So this is such a wonderful way to kick off the new year. And as ever, we have a whole host of events and things that are coming up around the bend. So we have another Max. Our next speaker is another Max. I promise we will stop the Max train after that. But Professor Max Bevilacqua of Harvard Business School is on next week presenting his new work, which I'm in the process of finishing. Negotiation, the Game Has Changed, which has just been released. And then a whole host of PON faculty coming up in February, Diana Chigas from Tufts and Joshua Weiss from PON and Bay Path University. So we are really looking forward to all that we have going on. We are also launching a variety of classes this semester, both virtual and in person. The next one is a one-day program next week on overcoming resistance and influence with Stevenson Carlbach. It is always a joy to have that class. So if you are not doing anything next Wednesday and still have a free calendar, you might consider signing up. Thank you to everyone for being with us. Thank you to our fabulous PON event staff. And we look forward to many more great events with you continuing into 2025. All right, everyone, be well.